The village shops of Barbados. Did you know that the village shops in Barbados used to be the social center, the community center, the economic center, the everything of almost every village in Barbados? Did you know that they provided what is known as social capital? Now let me explain about social capital. We talk about horizontal social capital and vertical social capital. And the horizontal social capital was provided by the assistance that the village shop gave, economically as well as socially and culturally, to the people around. Support. And the word capital, of course, means that there's value in it. So there was tremendous value in this horizontal social capital where the village shopkeeper and his wife, usually a couple, provided so much support for the village. And then the vertical social capital was the way they helped to look after the children. You know the phrase, it's a global village. And so the shopkeeper and his wife, they kept a good eye on the young people. And that is what has gone in Barbados to a large extent. And that bothers me a great deal. So the social capital has been lost. And you ask why? Basically, because society has changed, but one of the big catalysts of that change and associated with that change is the replacement of the village shop by the mini marts, owned and operated by the big people, the sellers of gasoline, oil, and all of that. They all have mini marts in the gas stations, and that took the business away from the village shops. And many village shops, therefore, lost their ability to support themselves. They simply went bankrupt, or the old people got tired and the young people didn't see a future because there was a mini mart just down the road providing all the groceries that they used to provide. When I was a boy growing up in Four Roads, at a little house called Spooner's, 200 yards from the corner at Four Roads, there was a corner shop known as Bob Clark, or P.A. Clark. Now, Mr. P.A. Clark was a man who'd made money in America, and he came back and he bought property at Worthing and in St. John. So we lived in a house which my father rented from him, and just down the road was the village shop, the corner shop. And it sold everything. It sold everything from the kerosene oil, which we and all the neighbors needed for the stoves, which were all oil stoves in those days, to the nuts and the bolts and the nails, to the food, all the common food stuffs, the salt fish, the cheese, everything that was served and packaged out in brown paper bags or brown wrapping paper. And then there was the sweetie jars, which really attracted us kids. You know, you got a few pennies and you said, can I go down to the shop? Because there on the front counter, in front of everything, were these big jars that sold sweets. And a few pennies would buy a few paradise plums, especially, and the barley sugars and all of those old-time sweets in these big jars with a big opening towards the shop assistant. So the kids couldn't put their hands in, only the shop assistant could. And in the corner of the shop, behind a kind of a cage, elevated with 3 little steps so that she was 2 or 3 feet above everybody else, behind this open cage was the lady in charge of the shop. And I remember her well from my entire childhood, a largely proportioned lady of a fair, medium brown complexion with stern-looking glasses, a stern-looking face, and a stern-looking bun at the back of her head, looking down on everything. There was no shop assistant who could get away with anything, and no child who could get away with anything. Nobody could come into that shop and quietly pilfer, because she would have seen everything with her gimlet eyes. That was the character of that shop. I don't recall a man managing. She was the boss. So in today's world, where the women are running the world, it started back there in P.A.'s shop. That shop really did sell everything. The madam was amazing and very memorable. And, you know, when we got older, we didn't just buy the candy. We would be sent to the shop on a Saturday morning because my mother had run out of sugar or flour or butter or something for her Saturday morning baking. That was a big thing. She worked every day of the week. Saturday morning she baked. So we would often be the messengers going to the shop for the kerosene oil or the flour or the butter or the sugar or the spice and all that's nice so that she could make all these wonderful things. But the village shop was more than a general purpose shop. It was so much the place where in most cases there was a husband and a wife, and they provided what I call that social capital, a continuous supply of advice and mentorship. And Sir Elliot Belgrave's book, which I'll come back to, tells you how it worked in that regard, because the husband and the wife each had their roles. And then for most shops, there was a place at the back where people could gather and fire a grog, or 2 grogs, or 3 or 4 grogs. And that could get even worse on a Friday night when people got paid and they may not even have reached home. So that next morning there was a very angry wife because they'd spent a great deal of the week's earnings firing grogs in the back of the shop. So that was, if you like, the downside of the shop. But it wasn't just the firing of grogs. It was the whole discussion of social life, of political life. And so what Sir Elliot writes about is the era of political sensitization in Barbados, where Dr. Charles Duncan O'Neill and Clennell Wickham and all of these early, serious, democratic-oriented politicians were moving things forward in Barbados. So that the village shop provided almost an informal debating society. And the people who went to town heard what was happening in town and brought it home and shared it with the people in the village. So it was a tremendous social center. And my friend, Dr. Peter Lorry, retired ambassador, foreign minister, foreign diplomat in Barbados, Peter Lorry, who has written a lot, like me. He loves writing, and he's written a wonderful book about the rum shops of Barbados. And he tells the story of the rum shops, individual rum shops, and some of the incidents there. And he, in his book, claimed a few years ago that there were about almost 1,000 rum shops in Barbados. Now, that's interesting because people have said that for every church there was 1, 2, or 3 rum shops. Now, we have 400 churches in Barbados. 400. 1 for every day of the year and 2 for Sundays. And so Peter said there were almost 1,000 rum shops. Well, I don't think that's the case anymore, because so many of them, as we will see, have gone bankrupt. Now, if you look at the first slide of the first rum shop, here is a thriving rum shop, which I used to go to as a boy, the P.A. Clark or Bob Clark Rum Shop, and that's now a mini mart, but it has expanded. There was, I don't know if there still is, but there was a nightclub at that one time upstairs, and that was Bob Clark's shop, and it was taken over by the father of the retired Edward Clark of Sagicor. He lived at Airy Hill Plantation, the little tiny farm near to Four Roads, and he took over that and ran that and expanded that into an even better modern mini-mart. But Peter Lorry said that these rum shops were everywhere, and I spoke to my friend Professor Sir Woodville Marshall for his views on rum shops, and he agreed entirely. He thought Peter Lorry's estimate was probably right, because he said growing up in St. Philip there were as many as 7 village shops along the Rice's Curtain Road. Now, if you know that road, it's only about 2 miles long, and Sir Woodville said there were 7 shops that he could remember very clearly along that stretch of road. Now, let's go to Sir Elliot. Sir Elliot grew up in Boscobel, the little village, as he called it, tenantry of Boscobel. Boscobel was the plantation which in 1911 was buried. The plantation house and yard was buried by the landslide. It was a massive landslide. But the village area of Boscobel was quite heavily populated. Sir Elliot grew up there. And of course, because of perhaps the distance of Boscobel from Bridgedown and the fact that it got buried, Barbadians used to have a way of describing Boscobel. Do you remember what it was? Behind God's back. Well, I don't think Sir Elliot liked that description very much. But he pointed out the role that the corner shop in the village of Boscobel played in his youth. And in his words, it was part and parcel of the culture and the very survival of those of us living in Boscobel. The shopkeeper, aided and abetted by his officious but well-meaning wife, was able to interact with the heads of almost every household in Barbados. And what the shopkeeper there did was to trust people. There was a verb in Barbados called trusting, which had a very specific meaning. It meant that the person who provided a service or goods of some kind trusted the person who had no money at the time to come back and pay eventually. And in the very tenuous economy of the plantation life of the 1930s and 40s, when Sir Eliot was growing up, the corner shop served almost as an informal bank in which the shopkeeper trusted the people who ran out of money halfway through the week. And so there was nothing to buy the emergency supplies until he got paid or she got paid on the Friday. And in the out-of-crop season, sometimes people had to be trusted for months until the crop season started again and they started to earn a full salary. Because in the old days, what would happen is that many of the people working in agriculture worked full-time in the crop, worked all up, earned a reasonable amount of money to support their family to a certain level. But in the outer crop season, they'd be just given a couple of days' work just to keep them involved and to keep them alive. But the pay was obviously 2 or 3 days and not a full week. So they often had to be trusted for months. And some of the shops, of course, went bankrupt because some of those people eventually couldn't pay. And the shopkeepers may have been too trusting because the Bayesian of the old days was a very generous, trusting person. And then, what about the role of the lady of the shop? Well, she was a kind of alternate mother. She was almost a foster mother for some of the children. She would have no hesitation in calling Mrs. Cumberbatch and saying, "Your boys, he did not speak to Mrs. Cricklow this morning. I saw them passing and he looked away. He can't be doing that. You need to put some manners in him." That was what shopkeepers would do. Or if the kids were having fisticuffs in the street and they were seen by the shopkeeper's wife, then they would get reported. So there was a communal spirit in which the shopkeeper's wife was very much a kind of informal foster mother and the inspirer of good manners, the kind of teacher. Let me read a bit of what Sir Eliot has said about the village of Boscobel and the role of the village shop there, and by extension, the role of the village shop in other communities across Barbados. He begins chapter 5. And let me say, for people who haven't read this book, it's the Notes of a Native Governor-General by Sir Eliot Fitzroy, with Alwyn Adams, who is a retired principal of Foundation School, my very good friend and a former senator. And Alwyn worked with Sir Eliot to produce this marvelous book, which is extremely readable. It's hard to put it down when midnight comes and your wife says, "Come to bed." You know, it's a marvelous book. It's beautifully written. And he says in chapter 5, in a very special way, the corner shop was part and parcel of the culture and the very survival of those who lived in Boscobel. The corner shop and the church were the only meeting places for persons living in the Boscobel tenantry. I believe it would be a mistake for historians to ignore the pivotal role played by the corner shop in the lives of black people in places such as Boscobel. It should not be left to oral storytellers alone, like me. By so doing, we run the risk of relegating to the dustbins of history one of the most authentic black institutions in Barbados for most of the 20th century. And he's right, because there is very little written about the village shop. It is almost a bit of lost history as people grow up, and they've grown up in the mini market, motor car, supermarket era. There's no doubt that the role which the corner shop played left a lasting impression on many of us in the village. I must confess, however, that at first I merely saw it as the only place in the tenantry where the female could go to buy her groceries or kerosene and the men to fire a grog or many grogs. However, as I grew older, I began to observe the workings of the corner shop more closely and was amazed to find that it not only went beyond the peculiar commercial arrangements, but also weaved itself into our everyday activities and significantly impacted almost every facet of life in Boscobel. And Sir Eliot goes on to talk about the relationship between the shopkeeper and his father, the influence he had on his father, and the influence he had on he himself, Sir Eliot, as a young boy with ambition, a bright young boy with ambition. So, what has happened to the village shop? Many of them have disappeared. All of this social support, social capital, as we say, the community spirit, the counseling, the cohesion, and the most important, economic support, but especially the advice to people and the influence, the networking in the village, all of that was unique. And what is sad, and I think it's almost tragic, is that that social capital has gone with the disappearance of the village shop. Neighbors no longer know each other. They no longer have that kind of social gathering place. Yes, of course, you have other ways of interacting. You have all the fetting that goes on, but it's simply not the same. Some of them have survived. Some of them have become known, especially in the tourist area. Many of them are known merely as rum shops. Some of them have expanded their offerings, the culinary offerings, from these classic things like the bread and two, that's two fish cakes, into much more exotic meals, eating places around, especially in places like Bathsheba. That has happened. So some have expanded, but many of them have basically, as we say, gone. And if we look at some of the other village shops around, you'll see exactly what I mean. The libraries, photographers have gone out, and here in Four Roads of St. John, we showed you the expanded Bob Clark shop at the corner, but just a little way away is the Bascom village shop, which was smaller, and that's all shut up. Next slide, please. We now see also in St. John, we see that wonderful great stone building, because you see, in many villages, most people lived in a wooden house, a chattel house of varying sizes. Some of them were only 1 or 2 unit chattel houses, but some were as many as 3 and 4 and had several bedrooms and a stone bathroom at the back and so on. But here was the epitome of the shopkeeper's success. This was John Yearwood's Gall Hill shop. This was a mansion. You can see it's built with coral stone blocks. So that helps to date it. We know it's post the 1830s. I don't know exactly how old it is, but it was a thriving shop when I was a boy. And now the old original building on the right is completely shut up, and a residence has been built on the left. So that's John Yearwood at Gall Hill. And in the same neighborhood, the next slide, the next picture, shows you Pat's Arts and Crafts shop at Carter's. Okay, and that's still got an open door. But next slide, we see also in the village of Carter's another former shop completely shut up, and you see this is becoming a botanical garden with lovely vines growing out of the wall, like most abandoned government buildings, which are the botanical gardens of Bridgetown and the Garrison, with ferns of all kinds, vines of all kinds, even big trees growing out of them. Next one. And then we move over to Miss Lane's shop in Wilson Hill. Now, I do not know whether this variety of shut-up, abandoned shops in St. John says anything about the socio-political neglect of the parish of St. John. Sometimes political neglect is good, because you retain certain attractive features of old. But if you look at St. John and you drive through the Clico plantations, past all the bush and the weed and the new trees and the cowitch, and then you see all of these shut-up shops, you begin to wonder what really happened to St. John, in spite of its beauty, in spite of the history, and in spite of the political representation. So let's move on. Miss Lane's shop, Wilson Hill, opposite the lovely little Wilson Hill Community Park, shut up. But we move over to Edie's Village, and Edie's Village shows that we have here a very excellent village mart, a kind of variety shop. It's small, but it's apparently very busy. Next one. And on the other hand, we look at Christchurch, St. Patrick's. Here is a burnt-out village shop. One of the big ones, a lovely 2-story building, quite an attractive building, big windows, well-ventilated, parapet roof to protect it from hurricanes, but that didn't protect it from the decline of the economy and from a fire. So there's another lost shop at St. Patrick's. And the next one, moving to Woodburn in St. Philip, here is an active shop. It's obviously not active because I see one chair piled on another chair, but never mind. This is the Woodburn bar and grocery, and this is very active. You see a customer here on the left. So that's good, a good sign. This is a good one. I don't know the occupants. Next one. And still in St. Philip, we have this very striking two-story building. Again, a very strong, well-built stone structure with a wooden balcony above. People can shelter from the rain underneath. This is Burton's Bar and Grill. And that has been closed and shut up now for quite a few years on the corner of the big Burton's Village in St. Philip as you head to Six Roads. So, last slide, I believe, is really a very sad-looking slide, which epitomizes where many of these shops are going. This is the village shop at Map Hill, completely digested, well, not completely digested, but being engorged by the woods at Maps Hill, and it will soon crumble like so much else that's crumbling, abandoned and crumbled in Barbados. So this I find very sad, because there are lots of these beautiful buildings which could be repaired, renovated, restored. Why would someone who wants to live in the village where they grew up not wish to move from a smaller house into a lovely two-story house like that at Burton Village, a lovely strong house which would not blow down in the next hurricane? Many village shops have been put out of use by the gas stations, the big oil giants, and they're selling everything. So the village shops have lost their role. They're standing derelict memorials of the social capital that was Barbados. And here I'll add a personal note. My daughter-in-law came to Barbados as a result of a relationship between her supervisor in London and she came to study social capital in Barbados. And she went all over Barbados at various villages, Shuri's village in Andrew, and villages around town and in St. George, looking at the social capital. And it was still, 20 years ago, significant. But she got that sense that it was being lost. And it really has been lost. And to me, it's a tragedy that's escaped the notice of both our politicians and our social scientists. I can find very little about the village shops on the web. I'm not seeing people talking about it. I'm not seeing research about it. There are all these abandoned shops, and all the money is floating out to the oil companies because they're the ones who have displaced the shops. To me, it's a huge tragedy, and it's got no comment or this is much the worse off for it. So I do hope that what the National Library Service is attempting to do to document and share relevant history of Barbados, the history of what is good about Barbados, the history of what is lost but perhaps can be stemmed, if we could stem the tide of the loss of the village shops. And we had a problem with village shops and many marts too being closed because of wild political agenda. The people who said, why are the big people open, the big shops open, the big shops open? Because if we follow the social distancing, if we all wear our masks, if we all greet each other only with an elbow or a fist, then why can't a village shop have one or two people in that space doing what is necessary to keep everybody alive, living, eating, and surviving? So I think to think much carefully about the aspects of Barbadian life which are special for us, which have served us well over decades, and to try to preserve as much of that social capital as we possibly can. Our village shops were a unique, very special feature of our culture. They have not attracted very much attention, and I congratulate the National Library Service for focusing on it, and I hope that your focus will produce some action to support the village shops and to stem the tide of the change that is not good for our social capital and our society. Thank you very much.